The night stretched endlessly over the remote countryside, a vast expanse of darkness swallowed by fields of wheat and towering forests. The sky was a deep void, the crescent moon barely casting enough light to define the shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Inside a lonely house, far from any neighbors, the air was heavy with silence. Only the rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures broke the stillness. The house itself seemed to breathe in the solitude, standing as a lone sentinel in the middle of the vast, open land. The protagonist, exhausted from a long day of work, sat in the dimly lit living room. A single lamp cast flickering shadows against the walls, its weak glow doing little to push back the surrounding darkness. Though the house had always been a place of peace, tonight was different. An unexplained tension pressed against the walls, creeping into every corner like an unseen presence watching, waiting. Something was out there. A cigarette felt like the only remedy. The protagonist sighed, stood up, and stepped onto the porch, craving the familiar sting of smoke in their lungs. But as they struck the lighter, illuminating their face in the darkness, the night seemed to exhale, long and cold. They were not alone. The wooden porch creaked underfoot as the protagonist stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind them. The night stretched before them like an endless void, swallowing the landscape into shadows. The moon, barely more than a sliver, cast a faint silver glow over the fields, barely enough to distinguish the swaying stalks of wheat from the encroaching tree line in the distance. The world felt too still, unnaturally so. The protagonist exhaled slowly, their breath visible in the crisp night air. They reached into their pocket, pulling out a pack of cigarettes with fingers still trembling from the unease that had clung to them all night. A flick of the lighter sent a small burst of flame dancing against the darkness, briefly illuminating their face before the tip of the cigarette caught fire. The first inhale was sharp, filling their lungs with the familiar, numbing burn. As they leaned against the wooden railing, staring out into the sea of darkness, the night seemed to breathe with them. The wind whispered through the trees, the distant crickets chirping in an unbroken rhythm, yet something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the feeling. That gnawing sensation at the base of the skull, the creeping awareness that something unseen was watching. They tried to shake it off, forcing themselves to focus on the horizon, but their hands were betraying them, shaking slightly as they took another drag. The cigarette glowed brighter for a brief moment, illuminating the space directly in front of them. The smoke curled and drifted into the night air, carried by a barely there breeze. And then, it stopped. Their breath caught in their throat as the smoke didn't dissipate as expected. Instead, it clung to something unseen, a shape. It was barely an outline at first, just a vague distortion in the air, but as the smoke continued to swirl, it revealed more. The contours of a face began to take form. Hollow, empty eyes, sunken and endless. A mouth slightly open, frozen in the moment before speech. The more the protagonist blinked, the clearer the figure became, its head tilted slightly as if observing them in return. Number not just observing, it was too close, mere inches from their face, close enough that if it had breath, they would have felt it. Their heart pounded, a deafening drum in the suffocating silence. A sickening chill slithered down their spine, leaving their entire body frozen in place. The cigarette slipped from between their fingers, falling to the wooden floorboards in a tiny burst of embers. And still, the face remained. A shape formed not from flesh, but from the very smoke they had exhaled, refusing to break apart, refusing to fade. Then it moved. Not in the way a person moves, not with the shift of muscles or the turn of a head, but in a way that defied logic, as if the very air twisted around it. The mouth opened slightly wider. Was it trying to speak? A dry, breathless rasp, like wind through dead leaves, brushed against their ears. Their body finally obeyed. With a choked gasp, they stumbled backward, their foot catching against the wooden porch. Their hands scrambled for something, anything, to hold on to. The door. They needed to get inside. Now the cigarette, forgotten, fizzled out against the wood. Their breath was short, shallow, ragged as they reached for the handle with shaking fingers. The air felt heavier, pressing in from all sides. The shadows around the house stretched, lengthened, creeping toward them like living things. The distant hum of insects had gone eerily silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The face lingered, its form shifting, changing, growing darker. Then, it lunged. The protagonist barely managed to yank the door open before they stumbled inside, their body crashing against the floor. They kicked the door shut behind them with a resounding bang, sending echoes shuddering through the empty house. For a moment, they just lay there, chest heaving, hands clutching the floorboards. Their heartbeat pounded against their ribs, each thud feeling like a countdown to something worse. The house was supposed to be safe, but the face, it had been so close, too close. And the cold sensation at the nape of their neck told them one undeniable truth. It might have followed them inside. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud, sending vibrations through the wooden floor. The protagonist collapsed against it, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Their fingers trembled as they reached up, fumbling to turn the deadbolt. Click. The lock engaged, but it didn't bring the comfort they expected. The house was silent, too silent. It should have felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven from the unknowable horror outside. But instead, the walls felt closer, the air thick with something unspoken. The dim glow from the single lamp in the living room barely reached the corners of the house, where the darkness stretched like living tendrils, waiting. They ran a shaking hand through their hair, trying to force their mind to rationalize what had just happened. Had it been real? The face in the smoke, the breathless whisper, the feeling that something was watching, no, lurking just outside the edge of perception. Their bodies screamed at them to move, to do something, anything. They pushed off the door and forced themselves to walk through the house, checking every window, every lock, every possible point of entry. Each step felt heavier, as if something unseen was dragging at their limbs. The kitchen window, locked. The back door, secured. The small windows in the hallway, latched shut. Yet no matter how many locks clicked into place, the unease remained. It wasn't just fear, it was certainty. Something had followed them inside. They turned, their breath caught in their throat, staring into the dimly lit living room. The shadows danced, shifting as if breathing on their own. The old wooden floor creaked just once, not from their own movement. They weren't alone. The realization sent an icy shudder down their spine. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, pressing against the back of their skull like an unbearable weight. But no matter how hard they stared into the darkness, nothing revealed itself. But it was there. They could feel it. Their legs nearly gave out beneath them as they reached for their phone on the nearby table, their fingers struggling to grip it as they unlocked the screen. 9/11. The ringing tone seemed deafening in the silence. Every second dragged on endlessly. Then, a voice. 911. What's your emergency? They swallowed hard, forcing words past the lump in their throat. There's someone outside my house. I don't know if they're still there, but I saw something. And their voice cracked as they struggled to form the words. I think they might be inside now. The operator's tone remained calm, but there was an edge of urgency beneath the professionalism. Stay where you are. Are your doors locked? Yes, I locked everything. Good. Do you have a safe place to hide? They glanced around the room, but every shadow felt like a threat. There was nowhere to run, no corner that felt secure. Number, I don't think anywhere is safe. Silence on the other end. Then, we're sending officers to your location now. Stay on the line with me. The protagonist could barely nod, their hands trembling as they gripped the phone like a lifeline. Another noise, a whisper of movement from down the hall. Their heart lurched into their throat. Slowly, they turned their head toward the sound. The hallway was bathed in darkness. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar, a black void beyond it. They could have sworn it had been closed before. A sharp chill crept down their spine, and suddenly, the voice from the phone seemed so far away. "We're on our way. Stay calm." But how could they? Because the darkness in the hallway wasn't just empty. It was watching them, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity. The protagonist stood frozen, the phone pressed against their ear, their breaths short and shallow. The operator's voice was a distant hum, drowned out by the oppressive silence in the house. From the hallway, the darkness loomed, thick and heavy like a living thing. The sensation of being watched had intensified, wrapping around their chest like an invisible grip, suffocating. Then, a knock at the door. The protagonist jolted, nearly dropping the phone. Their pulse hammered against their skull as they turned, eyes wide. The sound was sharp, precise. 3 solid knocks. "The police should be outside now," the operator's voice finally broke through their terror. "Can you confirm?" With trembling steps, they approached the door, peering through the small peephole. Red and blue lights flashed against the darkness, reflecting off the fields beyond the property. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces stern, their flashlights cutting through the thick night air. Relief surged through them, though it was hollow. They unlatched the door with shaking hands, pulling it open just enough to see the officer closest to them, a tall man with a serious expression, his hand resting on his holster. "Are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice level but firm. The protagonist nodded frantically, stepping aside to let them in. I saw something. Outside. Then inside. I don't know what it was, but..." Their voice wavered. "It felt real." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who had already begun sweeping a flashlight over the corners of the room, illuminating each shadow in turn. "All right," the first officer said. "Let's check the perimeter first. Stay inside and keep the door locked." The protagonist hesitated, but it felt like it was inside. The officer studied them for a moment before nodding to his partner. "We'll check both." The house felt smaller with them inside, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. The second officer moved down the hallway, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door to the bedroom, still ajar, loomed like an open mouth, its pitch-black interior swallowing the light. The protagonist's stomach twisted. They wanted to warn him, to tell him that something wasn't right, that the darkness wasn't just darkness. But before they could speak, the officer's radio crackled, a burst of static, then, "Found something." The voice belonged to the officer outside. The protagonist stiffened, their throat tightening. The officer nearest them pressed his radio. "Go ahead." There was a pause, then, a man, lurking near the tree line. The protagonist felt the air leave their lungs. The officer turned to them, his eyes sharp. "Did you see anyone outside before?" They swallowed hard, shaking their head. "Number, but I felt something." The radio crackled again. "He's just standing here, not moving." The protagonist felt a shiver crawl down their spine. "Approach with caution," the officer near them responded, motioning for his partner to regroup. The hallway was forgotten as the 2 officers moved toward the door, stepping back outside, leaving the protagonist alone. From the doorway, they watched as the officers strode across the field, their flashlights bobbing against the darkness. Beyond them, just at the edge of the trees, he stood. A shadow of a man, still, unmoving. His face was hidden, his posture unnaturally rigid. The officers' voices carried through the night, but he didn't respond. Then, he turned his head, not slowly, not naturally, but with an eerie sharpness, like a puppet on strings. The protagonist's blood turned to ice. Something was wrong. Then, as the officers reached for their weapons, the man smiled, and everything went black. The protagonist stood frozen in the doorway, their breath shallow, heart pounding in their chest. The shadowed figure at the tree line remained motionless as the officers approached, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the blinding light now fully illuminating his face. No, not a face. Something was wrong with it. His expression was twisted, not in fear, not in anger, but something else. A smile too wide, too sharp, stretching in a way that didn't feel human. His eyes, dark and hollow, were locked onto the protagonist, not the officers, not the lights, not the guns drawn in warning. Just them. One officer gave a sharp command. "Sir, hands where we can see them." The figure didn't move. A pause. Then, the other officer reached for his radio. "We have a non-compliant individual requesting backup." The figure tilted its head. The movement was unnatural, too quick, too precise, as if it wasn't something controlled by muscles but by an unseen force, like a puppet on strings. The protagonist felt a sickening wave of wrongness roll through their body. The wind had stopped. The crickets had gone silent. Even the flashing red and blue lights from the patrol car seemed to dim, as if the night itself was pulling them into a void. Then, the man moved. Not by stepping forward, not by walking, but by appearing closer. One moment he was at the tree line. The next, he was standing between the officers. No footsteps, no time in between. Just there. The officers reacted instantly. One shouted, the other reached for his weapon. But the man only smiled wider. Then, in a voice not his own, in a tone that slithered through the night like a whispering breeze, he spoke. "You shouldn't have seen me." The words hit the protagonist like ice water down their spine. Their knees nearly gave out as they stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. Outside, the officers shouted commands, voices breaking with confusion, with fear. Then, a struggle, a scuffle of boots against dirt, a sharp yell, the static of a radio cutting in and out. The protagonist pressed themselves against the door, their nails digging into the wood, too terrified to breathe. And then, silence. An empty, bottomless silence that stretched too long. Slowly, so slowly, they reached for the doorknob, their fingers trembling. Through the peephole, the red and blue lights still flashed against the endless fields. And the officers? They were standing by the car, motionless, too still, too rigid, just like him. The man was being led into the back of the police car now, his head bowed, hands behind his back in cuffs. And as he was placed inside, he lifted his gaze straight to the peephole, straight at them. And even in the dim glow of the flashing lights, they could see it, that same twisted, knowing smile, as if this was exactly what he had wanted all along. The red and blue lights faded into the darkness, swallowed by the endless stretch of fields as the patrol car disappeared down the empty road. The protagonist stood by the window, their breath shallow, their fingers gripping the curtain so tightly their knuckles ached. The house was silent again. But the silence no longer felt comforting. It felt like something was waiting. They let the curtain fall and stepped away from the window, their hearts still racing. Everything about what had just happened felt wrong. The way the man had stood there, the way he had moved, or not moved, and most of all that smile, a smile that didn't belong on a human face. Their body felt heavy as they trudged through the dimly lit house, their limbs stiff with exhaustion, yet sleep felt impossible. Their bed waited, but they already knew, if they closed their eyes, they'd see him. That twisted grin, those hollow eyes. And worse, the thought gnawed at the back of their mind, slithering in the quiet spaces of their thoughts. What if this isn't over? With a shuddering breath, they turned off the living room light and stepped into the hallway. The walls felt closer in the dark, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the absence of light. They hesitated at their bedroom door, hand resting on the knob, the unease coiling tighter around their chest. The memory of the face in the smoke, the voice that had whispered without breath, "You shouldn't have seen me." Swallowing hard, they pushed open the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind them. The air in the room felt different, heavy, as if it had been disturbed. They exhaled slowly, forcing themselves to ignore the chill creeping over their skin. It was just exhaustion, just stress, just fear. But as they pulled back the covers and slipped beneath them, their entire body tensed. Something was off. The bed sheets were cold, not just from the night air, but unnaturally cold, like someone had been lying there before them, like something had been waiting. A sharp shiver ran through them, but they forced themselves to stay still, gripping the blankets tightly around them. They squeezed their eyes shut, willing the exhaustion to take over, to drown out the paranoia that clawed at their sanity. The room was silent. Minutes stretched into hours, each second marked by the distant ticking of the old clock in the hallway. And then, somewhere in the darkness, so close it could have been just outside their door, the creak of a floorboard. Their breath hitched. Another step, slow, deliberate, like someone was moving carefully, like someone knew they were awake. The protagonist clenched the blankets in their fists, heart hammering against their ribs, their mind screaming at them to move, to run. Then, silence. The house was deathly still again. But they knew it was still there, waiting, watching, and one day it would come back. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. The protagonist lay rigid under the covers, their body tense, heart hammering against their ribs. The air in the room felt wrong, too cold, too still. They wanted to believe it was over, that the man or whatever he was locked away, gone. But the silence told them otherwise, because they could still feel it, a presence, a weight in the darkness, unseen but suffocating. Their eyes darted toward the door. The hallway beyond was shrouded in pitch black, a void that seemed to pulse with something unseen. The faint silhouette they had glimpsed before. Was it still there? Or had it moved? Their breath hitched as the floor creaked. Not from the hallway, not from the house settling. From inside the room, right next to the bed. A sickening chill washed over them. They squeezed their eyes shut, every nerve screaming at them to remain still, to not look, to not acknowledge it. Maybe if they pretended they didn't notice, it wouldn't. The mattress shifted. A whisper of weight pressed against the blankets. Something was there. Their pulse pounded in their ears, a deafening drumbeat against the silence. Their fingers dug into the sheets, the urge to scream locked tight in their throat. Slowly, so slowly, they opened their eyes and saw it. At first, it was just a vague shape, barely distinguishable in the dim light. A figure crouching, its outline warped, unnatural. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, twisting in a way that made no sense. Then it moved, not in a natural way, not like a person shifting their weight. It glided, leaning forward, the darkness curling around it like tendrils of ink spreading through water. A face took shape, barely visible but unmistakable. That smile, the same smile from the peephole, from the tree line, from the smoke. The protagonist's breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. Their body refused to move, muscles locked in primal terror. Then the thing spoke. No breath, no voice, just a whisper inside their head. "You thought I was gone?" A noise clawed at their throat, somewhere between a whimper and a scream, and then the lights flickered. The shadows convulsed, twisting violently as the figure dissolved into them. The weight lifted. The air shifted. The room was empty. The only sound was the pounding of their heartbeat, the rasp of their own breath. Was it real? Or had it left something behind? A reminder, a promise, that this was not over, that it had never left, that it was still watching, and one day it would come back. The silence in the room was suffocating. The protagonist lay frozen beneath the covers, their breath shallow, their limbs locked in place. The shadows had swallowed the figure whole, but the feeling remained. It was still there, somewhere, watching. They turned their heads slightly, their gaze darting toward the door. It was open wider than before. Had it moved? Or had something moved it? A cold sweat slicked their skin as they forced themselves upright. The room felt different. The air thick with something unseen, something pressing in on them from all sides. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:33 a.m. Time felt stretched, distorted. The world outside the window was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, just an overwhelming void. They had to move, had to do something. With slow, deliberate movements, they swung their legs off the bed, their bare feet touching the icy floor. Every nerve screamed at them to stop, to stay hidden beneath the covers. But it wouldn't matter. It had already seen them. The hallway loomed ahead, bathed in an unnatural darkness. Not the usual kind, not the absence of light, but something deeper, something alive. They swallowed hard, stepping forward. The floor creaked. A shiver ran down their spine. Then, a whisper, software close, right beside their ear. Still awake? A strangled gasp tore from their throat as they spun around. Nothing. But the air. It was colder now. Their heart pounded as they stumbled toward the living room. The dim glow of the streetlight outside cast weak, fractured beams through the windows, failing to push back the overwhelming wrongness that filled the space. Then, they saw it. The peephole. The front door stood slightly ajar, not enough to be fully open, but just enough for someone to be watching from the other side. The protagonist's breath hitched. They could see the eye, wide, unblinking, waiting. A choked noise rose in their throat, but they couldn't scream, couldn't move. Then, ever so slowly, the door creaked, opening, an inch, then another. The sliver of darkness beyond it stretched, yawning wider, pulling the air from the room. And then, the smile. It appeared first, hovering in the darkness like a grotesque crescent, stretching too far, too wide. The teeth, wrong, jagged, uneven. It knew. It had never left. It was always there, watching, waiting. And now, it was inside. The door creaked open wider, the sliver of darkness stretching, yawning into the room like an abyss. The protagonist couldn't move. Their body was locked in place, frozen in pure, unrelenting terror as the eye stared through the gap, wide, unblinking, watching. Then, below it, that twisted, jagged smile curled further, stretching past the boundaries of what should be humanly possible. Too many teeth, too sharp, too uneven, too wrong. A voice slithered into the room, low, whispering, but not coming from the door. Not from outside. It was inside their head. "You let me in!" A sharp, cold breath hit their skin, and their stomach dropped. The protagonist spun around. The room was empty, but it wasn't. The air had changed, thick, suffocating, tainted. The shadows at the corners of the room weren't just shadows anymore. They were shifting, writhing, pulsing like something alive, something moving inside them. They tried to scream, but the sound died in their throat. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, dozens, Hundreds, a chorus of whispers, overlapping, creeping into their ears, whispering things they couldn't understand. Then, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then they went out. The room plunged into total darkness, and in that abyss, footsteps, slow, deliberate, right behind them. The protagonist ran. They didn't think, just ran. Their hands slammed into walls, blindly reaching for something, anything, the door. But it was already open and waiting. The outside world should have been there. The porch, the fields, the sky. But there was nothing, just a black, endless void. And then, something grabbed them. A hand, a claw, something cold and wrong and hungry. It pulled, dragged them toward the door, toward the dark, toward... They screamed. And then, everything went silent. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the absence of sound, of feeling, of light. Then, faintly, a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. The peephole was still open. And on the other side, an eye, wide, unblinking, watching and waiting. The protagonist thrashed against the unseen grip, pulling them toward the open door, toward the void. The hands, cold, twisting, inhuman, clawed at their arms, their legs, tightening their grip with each passing second. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was alive, swallowing everything, dragging them in. The door yawned wider, too wide. The edges of the frame stretched, warping like melting wax, expanding into an endless chasm of swirling black, and inside, it waited. The shape of the thing was barely visible in the shifting void, a silhouette with no form, a face with no features, except for that smile, that horrible, twisted smile that had haunted them since the beginning. It had always been there, watching, waiting, and now it had them. A voice slithered into their mind. "You never should have looked." Something snapped. A force, powerful, unseen, merciless, yanked them forward. Their feet left the floor as they were dragged into the darkness. The last thing they saw was the inside of their home, fading, distant, unreachable. The last thing they heard was the sound of the door slamming shut, and then nothing. Silence, endless, suffocating, infinite, until knock, knock, knock. Somewhere, a door was opening again, and someone, somewhere, was looking through the peephole. Somewhere, in the quiet of another lonely house, a woman sat alone in her dimly lit living room. The night stretched long and silent, the faint hum of the outside world reduced to a distant whisper. She sighed, rubbing her temples, exhaustion weighing heavy on her. The room was warm, the glow of a small lamp flickering gently. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. She couldn't place it at first. The sensation was subtle, like an itch at the back of her mind. Then, knock, knock, knock. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the front door. It had been locked, hadn't it? Another knock. Slow, deliberate. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to her feet. Each step toward the door felt heavier, her heartbeat thudding loud in her ears. When she reached it, she hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the peephole. Maybe it was nothing, maybe just a mistake. But as she looked through, her stomach dropped. An eye stared back at her, wide, unblinking, waiting, and below it, stretching into an impossible, unnatural grin. The smile, somewhere in the unseen abyss beyond the door. A whisper slithered into her mind. "You shouldn't have looked." Click. The door unlocked itself, and the nightmare began again.